Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today we're going to be upgrading one of the picture pages with a few of the tips and tricks and skills that we've picked up over time. So this is one of my very earliest picture pages for the Regia Marina. As you can see, the pictures are a little bit cut off, then don't look particularly brilliant. So first I'm going to edit the section and just change it to 16 by 9. So a lot more of it is visible in the preview. Of course, you can then click on them to get the full photo anyway. Change the columns to 3 and the spacing down to 10, so they're a little bit more close packed, but you get a better look at the initial images anyway. So once the bleed is set to full, so they're spaced out a little bit larger, now I'm going to go into the edit the gallery and add a bunch of photos of the Regia Marina fleet, so in port and away from shore. Those have uploaded nice and quickly. So then, as you can see, because I've edited the gallery, it's just added it to the existing gallery. So now there's a bunch of rather nice shots all the way from the ironclad era through to the Second World War of the Italian fleet at sea. And that's a nice, easy upgrade. And now the Regia Marina page is a bit more populated and looks better. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. Hello everybody, you find us on the deck of USS New Jersey. And you might be wondering why we're looking at 20mm Oerlikon. We've looked at lots of those before. Well, this 20mm Oerlikon is due for installation aboard the ship. However, this has been cleaned using the more traditional preservation methods, rust, for removing rust, so wire wool, sandpaper, wire wheels, etc., and then been painted. So this is all ready to go. Over here is its friend. Now, as you can see, its friend is a little bit more worse for wear, but is also going to be on display on the ship at some point in the future. But we are going to be running a little bit of an experiment, because I happen to have with me a laser, and this is going to make USS New Jersey the only Iowa-class battleship fitted with a laser that could take your arm off. I'm not going to take my arm off because I value my limbs, but what I am going to do is I am going to use the laser to take the rust off of this 20mm Oerlikon. Why are we doing this, other than the fact it's cool? Well, the laser potentially has a number of advantages. You'll notice on the spring there's still a bit of paint. On the back here there is also still some paint. The laser can take that off just as easily as it can take rust off. But the laser is tuned frequency-wise to pretty much only take rust and paint off. If you use sandpaper, wire wool, sandblasting, grit blasting, dry ice blasting, whatever, that is incredibly abrasive. And that will gradually wear things down over time. It can make things not fit quite as well. And where you've got stamped markings, if those have degraded over time, especially with rust, an abrasive method of cleaning can mean that you lose them entirely. Also, at the end of the day, you have a lot of debris to deal with. If you're using something like sandpaper or a wire wheel, you've primarily got a lot of rust lying around. And if you're using something like a sandblaster, you've got all that grit, etc., lying around, as well as the sand. The advantage of the laser is that it pretty much vaporizes everything that you want vaporized. So, as long as you're in an outdoor environment like this, protective glasses and a nice breeze and you're fine. In closed environment, maybe you want slightly more robust glasses and a face mask, but that's really about it. The other thing is the laser is not going to affect things like rubber, plastic, glass, etc. So although we're doing our experiment today with a big lump of metal, in the future, if battleships and other museum ships wanted to use a laser for cleaning, then, for example, if you were to go in a turret and you look at one of the viewing periscopes, well, that's got brass, it's got rubber, it's got all sorts of things, bakelite, and little strips of steel visible. Now, if those little strips of steel get visible, bearing in mind quite often they're part of the moving components, you do not really want to use some kind of abrasive on that, because it won't work as well afterwards, because it's gone from a smooth finish to essentially a satin finish, unless you really want to go back and repolish it all, at which point you're removing even more stuff. And any kind of abrasion, even if you're really careful, the minute it comes into contact with any of those other materials, you're going to lose those materials as well, and scuff marks on Bakelite don't buff out. This wouldn't do that, but first stage experiment, we're going to hit up this, and hopefully there'll be some kind of time-lapse sequence, and I'm going to be filming it from up close with my not a GoPro, which is stuck to my head. So let's begin. So first thing you've probably noticed, especially with the head cam, is there is a focal distance wherein the laser is at maximum brightness and therefore maximum effectiveness. This is, with a complex surface like this, you have to just learn how to hold it at the correct distance. It's not too much of a problem. But one thing you'll also notice is that the sound of the laser is louder when it has more rust to clear and quieter in the areas where there is less rust. And that's quite a useful indication audibly as to, one, have you got the right focal distance, and two, have you actually succeeded in cleaning it off. And some of you may be looking at the close-up footage and going, oh, hang on, I can see a little figure of 8 pattern in there. And yes, you just about can in some places, but that's the very last bits of patina. As I'm running my hand along here, this is completely smooth. It is not engraving into the metal itself. And we're just going to hit this bit here, which is where the markings are, the stamped markings. There's about 4 different safety switches to make sure you don't turn it on accidentally. So as you'll be able to see from the head cam footage, not only are all these engraved markings nice and preserved, but we've also discovered through the power of lasers that there's some kind of what looks like enamel filling or very, very strong paint filling in those engraved markings, which wasn't visible because before they were completely covered with rust. So that's actually a bit of useful information for when this gun is eventually repainted. They may want to actually preserve this white paint. So let's move on with the rest of the device.
So some quick notes for those of you who might be interested. This is a 150 watt laser. At various points in this footage you might actually see the power unit come into view. It's about the width and breadth of a laptop. Obviously it's somewhat thicker, but it does fit in a standard carry-on suitcase, I discovered. The laser is of course generated internally within that unit and is then sent to the emitter via a rather long section of fiber optic cable, so important not to damage or destroy that. And it can actually be stuck on your back like a backpack if you happen to need to wander around with it quite a bit. It's not the world's lightest thing, it's also not the world's heaviest, so I didn't do that. I didn't need to. The fiber optic cable was long enough for me to just maneuver around and laser pretty much the entirety of this Oerlikon. I think I moved the generator unit once. Now, of course, my unit is from the UK, so it runs on 240 volts, which is the home native voltage of the United Kingdom. So we did need to get a simple step-up transformer for its use in the US. But of course, if you buy one in the US, then it will presumably work with standard US 110 and 120 volt power output. As I mentioned before, there are multiple fail-safes that you have to activate 3 different buttons and close a latch on the unit, and then you have to activate a on-off switch on the emitter, and then you have to have a dead man switch which you hold down constantly. So if at any point you drop it, let go of it for any reason, then, well, it's a class 4 laser, it will shut off. There are multiple settings as well. So in this particular setting, I'm using my favoured 30mm long, 2mm wide, and a figure of 8 repeating pattern, because I find that's the best way to remove rust over large areas. You can have point sourced, you can have circles filled in or hollow, squares filled in or hollow, lines as well. I tend not to prefer the lines for large scale work like this, purely because it is a very, very narrow setting, obviously, and if you move it even the slightest bit too fast, you end up with tiger stripes. Whereas the infinite figure of 8 loops that I'm using in this setting, I find at least, will actually provide much better coverage. And of course, it is cycling, so you have to come up with a balance for whatever it is you're doing. I could make this figure of 8 loop, for example, 50mm long and 20mm wide, but then you'd actually probably at that point physically see the poor old thing cycling back and forth. You can also adjust a number of frequencies with the laser, the primary one of which actually affects which materials it works best against. So if you dial it all the way down, it works fairly well against what you might call black rust or severe patina. If you dial it all the way up, it works really well against that bright orange flash rust that you get very early on in things. And in this case, I have it at about 40% through its frequency range, which seems to work quite well against this dark brown prolonged exposure rust that we've got on the Oerlikon. It is, of course, a class 4 laser, so it is not a toy. You do have to be very careful with how you use it, although the focal distance does help. Obviously, it is most dangerous at its focal distance. Less dangerous beyond that, but trust me, as someone who accidentally left the rubber lens cap on at one point when I turned it on, it can and will dump an awful lot of energy into things very, very quickly. So don't point it anywhere but where you're working. And yes, you can see people there in the background, but trust me, I was being very careful to keep at least a 45-degree angle away from them when at any point that laser was active, both in the horizontal and vertical planes, as you can see here. You can store up to a dozen different settings as well, because you can dial other things up and down, like the power output of the laser. Maximum output is 150 watts. And obviously you can dial all that down really, really low. So if you're going after something relatively delicate or relatively thin, like say a verified knife blade, and you don't want to potentially overheat it over a very extended period of application, you don't have to dump as much energy in. In this case, obviously I had the power cranked up because this thing was stone cold to the touch. I think the sun was warming the metal more than the laser was, even though it was doing quite a nice job of taking the rust off. And in almost all circumstances, you should be wearing a decent respirator mask. That's not airflow and oxygen type stuff. That's just something with a good set of filters on it. In this particular case, I was always working upwind from the laser. We're right next to the Delaware. There was a very, very strong breeze. We're massively in the open air, and it's my laser, my risk. If you're interested, there should be a link in the video description below, if I've remembered, to Lasertech, the company which I bought the laser from. They've been really good with the after-sales customer support. And of course, you can hire these cleaning lasers with operators to do the work for you. You can hire the lasers and then do it yourself, or you can buy them outright. And that comes with training, obviously, to make sure you stay safe.
So this is about 2 hours work, and as you can see, it's now looking a whole lot better. The setting I had the laser on was very aggressive against the rust, but not at all aggressive against the metal. It's still all nice and smooth. And as you might have seen from some of the intervening footage, there is actually a slightly different distance you have to have in order to vaporize off paint, at least this high temperature enamel paint the Navy likes. But because that paint is still doing protection, in most places I've left that paint on. It could be taken off, but, well, as I said, it's better to leave it on for protection, but also, whilst vaporizing rust isn't really too much of an issue, especially out here where there's a nice breeze, vaporizing paint, there's a few more volatiles in there that you don't necessarily want to breathe in, hence you'd probably want a face mask. Of course, the laser can go into where the actual barrel and spring assembly is, because wherever you can shine light, the laser can get. And as you'll be seeing, hopefully from some of this head cam footage, I have left some elements of the actual mounting still got some rust on them. That's for two reasons. Firstly, actually getting the laser unit right down in there is a little bit difficult. If the gun was lifted up, it'd be a bit easier to access. But there are ways around that using the laser, because at the moment I've got a 160mm focusing lens on, so I could have changed that out to a 320 focusing lens, and obviously that's the distance at which the laser actually focuses from the unit, and then I could have probably got pretty much everything that's in there quite easily. But I only brought the 160mm lens over here to the States with me, so that's kind of that. As you can again hopefully see from the head cam footage going around, it's now pretty much rust free. I hit most of the underside as well. A few of the springs there I probably just need to catch. You can see some of the old enamel paint there. And it really shows a lot of the difference, because the Old Navy high temperature enamel, here and here, that's stuck on quite well. But as you can see here with the gun shield, I did a couple little test patches, and the gun shield was painted in just, well, probably Home Depot standard grey or something like that, and the laser's just taken that off completely. It's actually quite nice and shiny, but although there is, as you can see, some rust there, I'm going to leave most of that, because if I do de-rust all of this, that's going to be one nice big flat surface, and that's going to flash rust very, very fast, because also this is not really the same kind of metal as, well, literal gun metal. So that'll help preserve everything a little bit more. Now, the only other thing to note at this stage is that in some areas where I've lasered the paint, you can see there are multiple layers of paint, and this outer layer, which looks like the same grey as this, has been stripped off, revealing a slightly older pinkish layer of paint. That's probably Navy issue. And you can also see here where whole sections of the paint have blown off. Now, a lot of this looks a bit like this, little spots of rust coming through, but of course when the laser attacks the rust, the light will get all the rust in the immediate area, and so while it might look on the surface like you've got these little weeping pinpoint spots, when you hit it you can sometimes end up blowing away all of this, but this is where you had rust underneath it. It just hadn't come out through the paint yet. And as you can see, the rubber, I mean, it's got paint on it as well, but the rubber itself is fine. Lasered all along here, no adverse effects to the rubber. So there you go, one somewhat cleaned up 20mm Oerlikon, ready for a little bit of further preservation work.
So, some final thoughts on why this is useful for ship preservation. Well, as I mentioned previously, this kind of a treatment is non-abrasive, so you don't lose the finish of the metal, and even if it looks a little dull, you can very, very quickly restore any shine it had. Additionally, because it's non-abrasive, it's not going to affect surrounding materials. The laser doesn't really go after them. They're on the wrong frequencies for the resonance that it generates. And therefore, you can treat stuff like complicated materials, binoculars, Oerlikons, and so forth, without risking the rubber, the plastic, the brass, etc. fittings. Although it does also do quite a number at cleaning up brass and copper alloy patinas as well. It creates absolutely minimal amounts of debris on really, really intense jobs. There's a fine coating of iron oxide powder left behind, but that's very easy to sweep up and deal with, as opposed to masses of glass or sand, which is pretty much the same thing, used for sandblasting. Even dry ice, which does evaporate off in an enclosed environment, has the hazards with builds-up of carbon dioxide and so forth. And of course, you don't need air pressure or any of that kind of stuff. You just need a standard power outlet and a cable. Now, what it can't do, at least with my little 150 watt unit here, is I can't clean an entire turret. I mean, in theory I could, but I'd be there for a very, very long time. So something like an Oerlikon like this, small fixtures and fittings inside a ship, or bits of equipment in enclosed spaces, that kind of thing is what a laser at this scale is perfect for. There are bigger ones, 300 watt, 1000 watt, etc. cleaning units, and those might therefore be more suitable for those larger scale macro applications. But I hope you found this little segue into ship preservation enjoyable. I do really think that the rust cleaning laser does have a place in the preservation of museum ships and artifacts in the modern world. Let me know what you think in the comments below about the process if you have any particular questions. If you'd like me to demonstrate it on other materials, maybe smaller materials and so forth, or if you happen to run a museum ship, particularly obviously in the UK because that's somewhat easier, but if you happen to be a museum ship that maybe I get in contact with in the future in an overseas trip and you want me to come and clean something for you, I'm perfectly happy to do that as a nice little demonstration. Now, for those of you who might be wondering, did I just rock up at Battleship New Jersey with a laser, which I had to explain twice to the various people who x-ray your luggage coming across the Atlantic, and just say, hey, I'm here to fire lasers at parts of your ship? Well, no, that's not quite how it works. Due diligence was done. Firstly, I've had this laser for quite a while, several months now. I have used it on my own belongings. This is before and after, here we go. Now, that meant I've cleaned medieval armor, obviously modern replica armor stuff that I wear for reenactment and so forth. I've cleaned stovetops, I've cleaned kitchen knives, I've cleaned old work tools. So I was very aware of what settings work best, what settings could cause issues, what settings just wouldn't work very well at all on this kind of rust. So I knew what I was doing going in, and as I mentioned previously, I had the full amount of training that was required to actually operate one once I'd bought it from the company that I acquired it from. And of course, Battleship New Jersey were very careful in their selection of what they were going to let me have a go at first, because as we mentioned, the other one, it's been cleaned off with wire wool wheels or wire wheels attached to angle grinders and so forth, which is a much, much, much more aggressive approach than the laser. So there was essentially zero chance of anything going wrong with this particular treatment. And of course, you can combine treatments. So if you wanted to use perhaps a somewhat more aggressive approach, be that physical or chemical, to strip the paint off of something, and that would leave you with a half rusted, half unrusted object, you could then continue on with the laser. And for those of you wondering, why didn't we disassemble the entire thing and clean it in every single spot possible? Well, this was a proof of concept to determine the efficacy of the laser in the first place as relates to preserving naval artifacts. So in the future, maybe that could be on the list. Anyway, thanks for joining me on this video. Hope you've enjoyed it, and see you again in another one at some point. Bye for now.